and convey how it is that the Asian Art Museum's painting can be dated to the Jin Dynasty. And a little bit about its history, the history of this painting, which is interesting and unusual. Very few people had paid much attention to the painting on the right, Clearing After Snow in the Min Mountains, until it was published, and an in-depth article written about it in the late 1960s as a possible or very likely Jin Dynasty landscape. But once that appeared, and once its similarities in composition and technique and style became apparent, its similarities to the Asian Art Museum's painting, as you can see here, other paintings began to emerge which are also likely to have been painted in the Jin Dynasty and which until recently were cataloged just generically as Sung Dynasty paintings, and which date to the late 12th and early 13th centuries, but which are clearly not Southern Sung paintings. They have nothing to do with that very lyrical, intimate style of Ma Yuan and Xia Gui and Mu Qi and other Southern Sung artists painting in southern China. One of the strangest and most tortured, tormented landscapes from the Jin is this painting on the right, which is like the Asian Art Museum's painting, painted mostly in ink on paper. It's in the National Palace Museum in Taipei. It has no signature, and it is almost certainly also a Jin Dynasty painting, and it has a lot in common with the Asian Art Museum's painting. Particularly the dominance in the composition of this cliff, the very clear S curve, which both of these paintings share, the presence of enormous pine trees rising out of boulders in the lower part of the painting, and also that very clear dark light use of ink in the construction of the rocks and the forms of the earth, and bands of mist, and the use of misty atmosphere to create areas of solid and void throughout the painting. The inscriptions on this painting, incidentally, all date from the Ming Dynasty, and they don't really help us. They're just poems. They don't really deal with the painting itself that much. Here's another painting, which is now recognized as a Jin Dynasty painting. It's anonymous. It's in the Freer Gallery in Washington, D.C. It's in ink on silk, and it also has many aspects of its composition which recall the Asian Art Museum's painting. These enormous trees here, these conifers, a bridge which crosses from rocks in the near foreground to the middle ground as there's a bridge here. There's a single figure in a boat right here. It's a very damaged painting. It's had a lot of abrasion to the surface. So you can see that parts of the painting are rather indistinct. But in its use of ink, in its use of this S curve and this big peak at the top, the presence of the waterfall here and water flowing through the painting, you see the dark outlines of the rocks here, which are very similar. There is a clear stylistic relationship between these two paintings as well. But when we come to the Yuan dynasty, to the period of the Mongol occupation of China after the Jin, this style of monumental landscape painting, almost certainly inspired by Guoxi's early spring or works like that from the 11th century, continues. In fact, this tradition of paintings dominated by a great central peak, painted with strong contrasts of dark and light ink, continue all the way through the Yuan, even up into the Ming dynasty. But there are differences in the way the ink is handled. One begins to lose the subtleties between, just in the way the ink is handled in paintings like this as you go further in time. You still have the strong contrast of dark and light here, but the space is less coherent in a way. The use of atmosphere is less skillful in terms of sort of tying the parts of the painting together. This is a 14th century painting on the right, also in Taipei, by an artist named Tang Di, who worked very much in Guoxi's lineage, probably in northern China. But I'm hoping you can see what I mean here. The atmosphere in this painting is much drier. You don't get these, you get areas of mist, but they're not quite as successful, I would say, in conveying the illusion of depth in space, which is one thing that mist can do very well. This is another fantastic Yuan Dynasty painting in the same style. This is a section of a hand scroll painted in ink on silk in the Toledo Museum in Ohio. I think one of the greatest Chinese paintings in America. It's not very well known. It's very much painted in the northern Sung style of guoxi. But if anything, these contrasts in dark and light are becoming much more mannered here. You don't have quite the subtleties that you get in terms of just the range, just the spectrum of ink tonalities that you would find in a 12th century or early 13th century painting. This is at least a good 100 years later. Okay, so just on the basis of style and technique, handling of ink, most scholars I know of agree that the Asian Art Museum's painting is earlier than the 14th century and later than the 11th century. But paintings like this are always a challenge, especially when there's very little to compare with. If you have a painting where if you have a painting in your collection where there are 50 other paintings in the same style, it's relatively easy to pin down when it was done, where it was done, and things like that. But if you have only 2 or 3 or 4 paintings to compare with, it's much more difficult to be, accurate in your dating of something. I'd like to shift gears for a moment and talk a little bit about the history of this painting in terms of its provenance. The painting today, and this is how you'll see it, both of these scrolls are in the gallery. The painting today has a Japanese mounting. And it is accompanied by another scroll which has inscriptions on it, a title here attributed to the great late Ming Dynasty painter, calligrapher, and theoretician Dong Qichang, one of the greatest painters in Chinese history, who lived in the late 16th and early 17th centuries. He died in the late Ming in the year 1636, right before the fall of the Ming. And the inscription reads, "Travelers among valleys and peaks by the northern Sung artist Fan Zhongli." Fan Zhongli is Fan Quan, one of the great towering masters of northern Sung painting. And signed here, "Seen by Dong Qichang," with a single seal of Dong Qichang. Now, Dong Qichang was a great connoisseur of painting. There are many early Sung and Yuan paintings that have his title or colophon or inscription. But as we now know from extensive research by Richard Barnhart, a great American scholar of Chinese painting, Dong Qichang was actually terrible as a connoisseur. He wrote whatever came into his mind. And it's interesting, there were other Ming Dynasty collectors before him and during his lifetime and in the early Qing, Chinese collectors who were much better connoisseurs than he was. He made unbelievable mistakes in his connoisseurship. He could be off by 200 or 300 years. He would attribute something to an artist that had nothing to do with that artist. But he was a huge, towering figure in the world of connoisseurship, in the world of late Ming art. He wrote the great theory of the northern and southern schools of Chinese painting, which has largely dominated Chinese art historical research and painting up to the present day. But if you look carefully at what he wrote about paintings, actually on paintings, he's wrong about half the time, which is not a good track record for a connoisseur. But he was a huge ego, and people have just been afraid to challenge him until really the late 20th century. But he was surprisingly slipshod in his connoisseurship. But he had such an air of authority. And he was very influential. He was a very high-ranking official in the court. He was a wealthy man. And he had a domineering personality. Until very recently, his attributions have never been challenged. But I'm going to show you, I hope successfully, that the Asian Art Museum's painting has almost nothing to do with Fan Quan, and instead has a lot to do with Guo Xi, the 11th century painter. I'm going to talk to you in a few minutes about the history of the painting. It has a number of collector seals on it, which we'll look at. And also on the scroll, which is designed to come with it. And it's interesting, the painting is mounted in a Japanese mounting. And it was in Japan in the early 20th century, briefly, in the 1930s. But whenever you see a mounting, and you can see this when you go into the gallery, with gold threads in the brocade at the top and bottom, for example, and at these parts of the painting, the silk strips that hang down loose and are not attached, these are all typical features of Japanese mounting. You will never see a Chinese mounting with gold threads in the brocade. The colophons and the inscriptions here are mounted on a Chinese mounting. In fact, this is a great object lesson in the difference between a Chinese mounting and a Japanese mounting. The Japanese mounting tends to be much busier, darker silk. Chinese mountings tend to be very understated. Not that they don't have a pattern figured in the silk. Quite often there's a very faint pattern. Even in this painting you can see it. But it's possible that at one time these inscriptions, which are from the Qing Dynasty, and this one presumably by Dong Qichang from the late Ming, were mounted on the side of the painting in an older mounting, but they have been separated, and that's not unusual. So this painting today is housed in a Japanese wooden box from the 1930s. I'm going to show you pictures of that, and a separate Japanese box for this scroll, which is a scroll of documentation. So here is the painting on the right. Here is the title, Travelers Among Valley and Peaks, by the Northern Sung artist Fan Zhongli or Fan Quan. That's Zhongli is one of Fan Quan's nicknames, and seen by Dong Qichang. Okay, here's a painting by Fan Quan. This is his one known authentic work that I showed you earlier. Painted probably around the year 1000. Assuming the Asian Art Museum's painting was painted around the year 1200, there would be about 200 years between these two paintings. There's a real difference in technique between what you see here and what you see here. In this case, although the rocks and mountains are outlined with a fairly dark line, the outlines are much darker and more fluctuating in width, the lines here, than in this painting. Also, although both paintings are dominated by a big central peak and there are tiny little figures at the bottom in both, here, as I pointed out before. In fact, the Asian Art Museum's painting owes much more to this work by Guoxi that we know was in the Jin Imperial Collection and was in northern China and presumably seen by at least a number of important painters working in the north during the 12th century. Most similar are the very thick fluctuating outlines of the rocks. You can see that very clearly here. It's almost an identical way of outlining rocks. And within the outlines, texture strokes, a combination of actual little texture strokes and wash, very thin washes to build up the three-dimensional, the illusion of three dimensions in the rock forms. And above all, in the overall composition, this S-curve in the main peak, very much echoed in this painting and several of the other paintings that I've shown you. Now, I should mention that not everyone is convinced that the title by Dong Qichang is authentic. I first published the painting in 1979, and at the time I didn't believe that the title was actually by Dong Qichang. The reason is not that the calligraphy is no good. The calligraphy is actually quite good, although there's some areas where the strokes are a bit wobbly and a little weak, and I'll show you that in a minute. The reason, I mean, you can see that here. You can actually see the wobbling lines a bit. But, you know, everyone's got a bad day sometimes. The problem is this seal. I've never been able to find another example of this seal. And there are hundreds of works by Dong Qichang and many of his seals on earlier paintings. This seal, this is the only known example I know of this seal, which doesn't mean it's not genuine. It just means it could be a problem. Also I should mention that the great mainland Chinese connoisseur Xu Bangda, who is one of the top connoisseurs of early painting in China, who passed away about a decade ago, he did not believe that this was genuine at all. He actually published it as fake. But he never came and saw the painting. I think he came to San Francisco, but when he published the painting and the colophon, or the title, at the time he said, I only know this from a photograph. He actually thought the painting dated to the Qing Dynasty, which tells you never judge authenticity of anything from a photograph. Never, never, never. Unless you can't help it. Above all, never buy a work of art from a photograph unless you just can't get to London or New York or Hong Kong. But have somebody else go look at it for you. You can make unbelievable mistakes. Photographs lie. You've heard of Photoshop, that's the new lying. Used to be the printing in the darkroom, but you just cannot trust a photograph. And he honestly admitted that he had only seen the painting from a photograph at that moment, which I think was in the 1980s. Regardless, whether the Dongqichang inscription with the title is genuine or not, the title with Dongqichang's signature was attached to the painting certainly by the beginning of the Qing Dynasty. So this has been with the painting ever since. There's also a seal of Dongqichang on the painting, right? Let's see where it is. It's right here. That seal also, I have not been able to find in any of the seal compendia that include seals by Dongqichang. Again, it doesn't mean that it's not real, but it's a little suspect. The painting also has in its box old titles by Qing Dynasty connoisseurs. This is an early 19th century title. So clearly the painting has been very much appreciated by numerous connoisseurs in the Qing Dynasty. Here's another very beautiful title that was maybe once attached to the side of the painting. This is by a late 18th or early 19th century painter. The inscription written in very beautiful clerical script. Those are now detached from the scrolls and are just in the Japanese wooden box. But they've been kept, which is great. It's great to have those things. Then we have two colophons here. The one on the left is actually dated. It's by a fairly obscure writer named Xu Yongxi. I have not been able to find much about him. I have not been able to find any other seals of his, but it's dated 1733. It follows the title in assuming that the painting is by Fan Quan. And it starts right off talking about Fan Quan's landscape painting. It's just a sort of generic discussion of the beauty of the painting, where Fan Quan got his impetus. He mentions the Sung Dynasty painter Li Cheng, who's a contemporary Fan Quan, and so on. It's signed here and dated, as I said, to the year 1733. This inscription over here is by a much more famous Qing Dynasty scholar and connoisseur named Wang Fanggang. And that inscription is dated 1757. So both of these, this was written on the left, was written during the Yongzheng Emperor's reign in the early 18th century. This one written during the Qianlong period. And these are all genuine. These two colophons, they both assume that the painting is by Fan Quan, as the title attributed to Dongqichang says. They don't question that. So really, until, I would say, the early 20th century, anyone who saw this painting believed that it was by Fan Quan. Now, one thing that's interesting is that Dongqichang, if he wrote this, owned this painting by Fan Quan. In fact, if you go to Taipei and look at this painting today, the inscription at the top, mounted above the painting, is written by Dongqichang, and it has his seal, so we know this was in his collection. Dongqichang, however, probably never saw Guoxi's early spring. If he had, he almost certainly would have noticed the similarities in composition, in technique, and might have attributed this to Guoxi. But he didn't. He did own a painting by Guoxi, or attributed to Guoxi, which is now in the Freer Gallery in Washington, D.C. It's probably a later copy after Guoxi, but it's a Sung Dynasty painting. But he had probably never seen this painting. Now, it's interesting, both Fan Quan's Travelers and Guoxi's Early Spring were in the Imperial Collection in Beijing in the early Ming Dynasty, actually in Nanjing, because the first Ming capital was in Nanjing in 1368. Only in 1421 did it move back up to Beijing. And both of these paintings have the seals, inventory seals of the early Ming court. But by the late Ming, both paintings had left the imperial collection. We know that because we know Dong Qichang owned this painting. How he got it, we don't know. Maybe somebody else, maybe an emperor gave it away as a gift, maybe somebody stole it, nobody really knows. But we know that by the 1590s, Dong Qichang owned this painting. I doubt if he ever saw this, because this was in a private collection in the late Ming. There's no inscription of Dong Qichang on the painting. He had a canon of his favorite works of Sung Dynasty painting, which he had all of his students copy. There are several albums by artists like Wang Shimin of the early Qing, Wang Jian of the early Qing, Wang Hui, all artists whom Dong Qichang influenced or actually taught. And there are copies there of the Fan Quan that Dong Qichang owned, later Wang Shimin owned it. This Guoxi is never copied, which suggests Dong Qichang didn't even know about this painting. And we're talking about an age prior to photography, when it was easy not to know things, unless you had seen it. Okay. Somewhere after the fall of the Qing dynasty, the painting went to Japan. Now, this probably happened right after the end of the Qing. I'm guessing sometime after 1911, because the painting has this Japanese box with a title written by one of the most famous Japanese connoisseurs of Chinese painting, a man named Nagao Ko, or Nagao Unzen. You're looking at the lid of the box here. Strangely, it has a different title from the one Dong Qichang had given it. Instead of Travelers Among Valleys and Peaks, it's now Travelers in Autumn Mountains. I'm not sure why Nagao wrote this title, because he also he owned all of this. He made the box for this also. So that's a bit mysterious why there are two different titles. Maybe he just thought it was an autumn scene and should have a new title. Titles do change over time. So here's one of the old title slips here that's kept in the box. This is Nagao's Inscription, in which he assumes the painting is by Fan Quan. So the authorship is not doubted by Nagao. By the way, here's a portrait of Nagao. This is one of my favorite photographs. This was taken in Kyoto in 1919. It's taken at the occasion of a going-away party for the great Chinese epigrapher or student of Chinese writing, Luo Zhenyu, who was one of the early students of oracle bone inscriptions, wrote many books on ancient bronze inscriptions. That's Luo Zhenyu in the center. He came right after the Qing dynasty fell. He went to Japan. He was loyal to the Manchus. He was loyal to the Qing court. This was after the founding of the Republic under Sun Yat-sen. Luo Zhenyu always dressed in traditional Qing robes, and he was working to restore the last emperor to the throne, to restore Puyi back onto the throne, which failed. But, you know, a lot of revolutionaries in China had gone to Japan to spend time, and so he had lived in Kyoto for 8 years, and during that time he supported himself by becoming an art dealer. He brought hundreds of Chinese paintings with him to Japan. These are now in museums in Kyoto, in Tokyo. Sherman Lee bought some of them are in Cleveland, Ohio now, and they all have Luo Zhenyu's inscription, because he was also a pretty good connoisseur of painting. I don't know that he owned the Asian Art Museum's painting. There's no inscription by him on the painting, which suggests he didn't own it because he loved to write colophons. But this is a very interesting photograph taken in Kyoto at a party to say goodbye, because he's about to go back to China. And in the painting includes a very wealthy Japanese businessman or banker who was a collector also, Tsuyoshi Inukai. This is the great Meiji painter Tomioka Tessai, who lived until 1940. It's interesting, Luo Zhenyu and Tessai were both the same age, born the same year, died the same year. And at either end are the two greatest Japanese connoisseurs of Chinese painting of the Meiji and early Taisho and early Showa period, sort of 1910 to 1940. The younger one, was Naito Konan, who wrote many, many books on Chinese painting in Japanese, and Niguel. Niguel Ko is the one who wrote this inscription and had the box made. That's his name, Niguel Ko. And he died in 1942. And you'll see his inscriptions on many Chinese paintings that had come to Japan. So there's one box for the painting. This is the box for the other scroll that has the Dongqi Chang title and the colophons. And it says here, the colophons, the Tiba, on Fan Quan's Travelers Among Autumn Mountains, inscribed by Niguel Ko. And that's his seal, his nickname, Unzan, Rainy Mountain. This inscription is dated 1937. Which is wonderful because that proves that the painting was in Japan in the 1930s. 2 years later, in 1939, it was published. For the first time in its history, a photograph was published in the great Japanese art magazine Koka. And this is the cover of the 1939 journal. We actually have it in LACMA's library, amazingly. And I'm sure you have it here. Clearly, very few people have looked at it, so it's in pristine condition with all of its great collotype coloring. And there's a short article about the painting. The article is not signed, so we don't know if Niguel wrote the article or somebody else. But this is you can see it's a fold out. It's an oversized image. It's a photograph published there. And the article, which is here, has the original title, Travelers Among Streams and Mountains. And for the first time, the authorship, the attribution to Fan Quan is doubted. So this is an important moment in the history of the painting. And whoever wrote the article, it goes on for 2 pages, says that he thinks it's a Yuan dynasty painting, which is normal because it's clearly more mannered, a bit more than either Fan Quan or Guoxi. He states that it resembles Guoxi more than Fan Quan, which is another very important step in its scholarship. And the attribution of the painting to the Yuan dynasty, to the 14th century, sticks all the way until Avery Brundage acquires it. I don't know from whom Brundage bought it. I don't think the museum actually has that record. I asked. But it was given to the Asian Art Museum in 1966. Its accession number is B66D1, so we know when it came. And it was then later mentioned by James Cahill as a Yuan dynasty painting from the 14th century. As late as 1980, Cahill thought it was a Yuan painting. So the confusion about what this painting is has extended deep into the 20th century. The painting is it's important for many reasons. I think it's important because it almost certainly is a Jin Dynasty painting. There are, as I said earlier, very few Jin Dynasty paintings in the world, probably less than 20, compared to the hundreds of Southern Sung paintings that survive. So I'd just like to end by showing you a few other examples of lost Jin Dynasty paintings, these in American collections. This is a very famous hand scroll in the Cleveland Museum of Art. It was published by Sherman Lee and Wen Fong in the late 1950s. It's called Streams and Mountains Without End. And when they first published it, they thought it was a late Northern Sung painting, painted around the year 1100, before the beginning of the Jin. Since then, it was published in Japan as a Jin Dynasty painting. It's also anonymous, no signature. And I published it as a Jin Dynasty painting in the late 1980s. It's sort of hard to gauge a painting like this without actually seeing it. It's in ink with very light colors on silk. No signatures, also came from the Qianlong Imperial Collection. But one thing that's very typical of it are these contrasts between dark and light ink that I think you can see quite clearly throughout the landscape. Although it's because it's a long horizontal composition, the mountains are very low. It's not one of these big towering vertical compositions. Another painting in Cleveland that was bought in the early 1980s I don't think Cleveland has published it, although there's a new catalog coming out this fall of Chinese paintings in the Cleveland Museum, but this was published after the great 8 Dynasties of Chinese Painting exhibition in 1980. This is a detail of a long hand scroll, also in ink on silk, now in Cleveland, on an illustration of the great poem by Tao Yuanming, the early 6 Dynasties period poet, called The Homecoming, where Tao Yuanming, who is shown several times in the painting, leaves his official post and returns to his estate in the countryside. And the landscape is also very typical of Jin Dynasty painting, has some similarities to the Asian Art Museum's painting, the dark wavering outlines, the contrast of dark and light ink over the surface. Here's a detail of a painting, a long hand scroll in the Art Institute of Chicago called the Wang Tren Villa. This is an illustration of the great Tang poet Wang Wei's poem, series of 20 poems about his estate outside of the Tang capital of Chang'an. It was a subject he painted in the 8th century in the Tang Dynasty. His original disappeared long ago. This is just a tiny detail of a very long painting that illustrates that theme by Wang Wei. And this happens to be the earliest surviving painting in the world of that subject, of that theme. So it's a very important painting, very little studied. It's another painting. It's been in Chicago since, I think, the 1960s. Scholars have just ignored it pretty much, possibly in part because it's hard to date. It's hard to know. Is this northern China, southern China? Is it northern Sung? Is it southern Sung? Is it Jin? I'm pretty sure it's a Jin Dynasty painting, but this is the only image I could find to show you today, so one would have to see more of the landscape. But you're very fortunate to own this painting here in San Francisco. I think there are fewer than 5 Jin Dynasty paintings in America, and this is probably the most important, as well as being one of the most mysterious. So I'm going to end there. Thank you very much. And we have time for questions.